The sign is a synchronic description of meaning. It's a description of meaning at a particular moment, any particular moment in any particular community of speakers in a language. Because it's synchronic, by definition, it's not very good for describing history, except the sign is arbitrary and conventional. These two facts mean that in any group of speakers, a sign can be rearranged or a sign can be replaced. And when we start observing the signs in a language, let's say words, being rearranged, being associated with new meanings, being pronounced differently, or being replaced, or simply done away with, then we can say the language is changing, and now we can begin a diachronic, a historical description of language change, variation over time. When we first discussed the sign, we did it in terms of words, in terms of lexicology. That's where everyone starts with it. But this same description of meaning applies to all of the various dimensions of a language. The rules for how you organize words into meaningful order, that is your syntax, those rules are arbitrary and conventional. The same is true of your word formation rules, morphology, and your rules for selecting and arranging sound, phonology. This is even true of extra-linguistic considerations like intonation. So we could say this is true of intonation, or we could say this is true of intonation, and recognize that our commitments here are both arbitrary and conventional, and particular to definite groups of people. This video is here to give you a fast overview of the written history of English up to the modern day. So, in its origins, we know very well that during the time of the Roman Empire, there were groups of Germanic-speaking tribes speaking languages related to one another in Northern Europe, and these groups were speaking languages that eventually developed into Dutch and into German and into Danish and so forth. They also evolved into English. Sometime around the year 450, the date's conventional, tribes known as the Angles, who spoke Anglish, which is now English, and Saxons, and yes, possibly Jutes, migrated into Britain to fill a power vacuum left by the collapsing Roman Empire. These English speakers lived in a world that was dominated by Roman political, military, and textual culture, and here you can see a record of that in the symbolism at work in this medal, which is also one of the oldest written records of English. These Angles and Saxons, speakers of Old English, like other Germanic tribes, would occasionally write using a runic alphabet. This piece of jewelry is one of the earliest records of written English, and you can see signs of a cultural contact between the empire and those so-called barbarians here. You can see that there is a depiction of the legend of Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome, here at the bottom, and there's a Roman helmet, but you can also see that the soldier wearing the helmet is wearing a beard, not a Roman thing to do, that's Germanic, and he appears to be howling like a wolf. This is also not a Roman thing to do. That's the sort of thing you do in a Germanic culture where the wolf is a totemic animal with mythic importance. We can perhaps see those Roman symbols reinterpreted through a Germanic cultural frame of reference here. And of course we see the runes written around the edges, this Germanic alphabet spelling out Gaigo Gai, Maga Magai, which is perhaps the howl of a wolf, or perhaps it means she-wolfed, and a gift for a kinsman. Over the next few hundred years, the Angles and the Saxons, and from now on we'll just call them the English, assimilated to the culture of southern Europe. They adopted Christianity, and with it the practice of reading and writing in Latin. The vast majority of medieval writing from England is in fact in Latin, and we can see that here in this copy of the Gospel according to John, which happens to be the oldest intact book in Europe, you can get a lovely overview here at the British Library, where you can go straight to the digital facsimile and navigate to an image of the page here. We can see the very beginning of the Gospel according to John. In principio erat verbum, et verbum erat apud Deum, et Deus erat verbum. If you know your Latin, you can tell those are the first lines. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This is actually one of the most basic reasons that English is such a nightmare to spell. The classical Latin alphabet only had 23 letters in it, but English had far more sounds, and the Latin alphabet's especially impoverished with regard to vowels, having only 5 symbols, and English, even modern English, has a dozen symbols. So all kinds of compromises had to be made that we'll learn about in a minute. Once people began writing English in earnest, a genuine textual tradition arises, and from there we divide the history of English into 3 general periods: Old English, Middle English, and then Modern English, which I will outline for you in brief. Here we have the most famous monument of Old English. This is Beowulf, the first page. It's an old poem in a 10th century manuscript, and you can go examine it closely by following the link to the electronic Beowulf site. One thing you can tell is that the words and the syntax and every other aspect of Old English have changed quite a bit over the last 1,000 years. Beowulf begins this way: Hwat we gardena en yerda hon thur kuninga frum je frunnon, huda athelinga sellen fremedon. That's difficult for your typical modern English speaker to understand. However, you notice we're using the Latin letter forms, and we can see a couple of special things. Latin didn't have a good W, and so a runic symbol was borrowed into the Latin alphabet as it was adapted to writing English. This is called the Win rune. This is we. And it also didn't have a grapheme for the TH sound, and we have that here with the Thorn rune, Theod, borrowed out of the runic alphabet, and complemented by this crossed D, which was borrowed from Irish scribes, actually, who had the same problem and came up with a different solution. Both symbols made their way into the writing of Old English. By the mid to late 1300s, English had changed so much that a modern speaker can read it with just a little bit of help. This is partly owing to the Norman invasion that added French to the literate culture of England and disrupted that old textual culture of so-called Anglo-Saxon, we should say early medieval England. This is the beginning of the Canterbury Tales in a deluxe manuscript held at the Huntington Library. You can find it here. And in a close-up, you can see that the letter forms may look a little more modern to you in certain respects, but they still don't have much to do with our modern writing. In typeface, though, you can probably just about read this Middle English. Juan that April with his shore sote, the drucht of March hath persed to the rote, and bathed every vine in switch liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the flour. Juan Zephyrus eke with his sweete breath, inspired hath in every holt and heath, the tender croppes, and the younge sun hath in the ram zalf course runne, and smalle voles maken melodie, that slepen all the nicht with open eie, so prieketh hem natuur in hier courages, than longen folk to go on pilgrimages. By around the year 1500, some changes that were underway during the Middle English period had carried through far enough that we began to think of the language as modern. This is a retrospective judgment, of course. We call it modern because it's not too hard for us to read, as you can see here from the first page, or the cover sheet actually, of the so-called Bad Quarto of Hamlet from 1605. Notice, by the way, we are in the world of print. This is no longer handwritten. That's an important technological change in our written culture of English. From this time on, from around 1500 on, books start to become cheaper and mass-produced, and literacy grows, and our record of written English becomes much bigger, to use a technical term. There are just a lot more books surviving. You can also tell some things have changed. We no longer use this tall F. We no longer use these CT ligatures, for example. We don't spell copy that way or again, but we don't have any trouble understanding this or reading it either. Do notice, by the way, how modern that typeface looks. This is typical of the so-called Roman type that was used to present mostly secular texts in this era. If we take a look at the other most famous early modern text in English from the King James Bible in 1611, contemporary with the life of Shakespeare, we see a typeface outside of the titles that imitates the formal handwriting of the later Middle Ages. It's a conservative letter form that has to do partly with the religious nature of this text. Let's take a look at it. And here again we have the beginning of the Gospel according to John, and we can read it quite well in this early modern English. And here's how it's likely to have sounded. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men, and the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. Things have changed since the printing press hit the scene in the late 1400s. First we had audio recording and then video recording, so we have much more information about the recent past pronunciation of English than we have for periods, prior to about 1900. And then, of course, with the development of the internet, we have a radically different way of arranging text. This is played into some other factors in the social world that affect the development of English. Here's the Wikipedia, and there's a phenomenon unto itself, the collaborative production of text. But here is the Wikipedia discussion of how hypertext works, arguably a form of English use that just wasn't possible until pretty recently, a way of representing meaning. And of course, English is a world language. More people have a stake in it now. It's not just a small-time language spoken on an island off the coast of Europe. It's a language spoken everywhere, and in fact, spoken by more people who use it as a second language than by people who use it as a first language. And these second language speakers don't simply imitate what we can call native speakers of English. They devise their own patterns of usage, as you can see in this Kenyan sign, no picking or alighting of passengers outside omnibus station. And we can gauge the scale and scope of second language speakers' international influence on language pretty well from these maps in some ways. And then, of course, there is the algorithmic influence on the development of English, there with Alexa hiding in her little hockey puck. All of these things come together in our new writing technology on the internet, and in fact, if we want to learn about small towns in Iran, we will read perfectly comprehensible articles written in English by people who almost certainly do not use it as a first language. Several learned men and religious figures has stemmed from Ashtian. Doesn't sound like it was written by somebody who grew up speaking English in a household, and yet, nevertheless, it's a perfectly meaningful and useful sentence that's going to influence not just people, but also the algorithms of Google and all the rest the algorithms that influence people's usage as well. So, English from prehistory to the present day, that's the broad outline. We're going to try to tell this story in as much detail as we can handle over the course of the next 16 weeks, and I'm glad you're here for it.